The door didn't slam. That's what he would remember most years later. Not the sound of anger, not shouting, not even the words that had been said before. Just the quiet, almost gentle click of the door closing, like it didn't want to disturb anything. Like it didn't want to admit that something permanent had just happened. 7-year-old Keanu Reeves stood in the hallway, frozen in a moment that felt too big for his small body to hold. His fingers were still curled around the edge of the wall as if he had been about to step forward, about to say something, about to stop it. But the moment had already passed. His father was gone. Not the kind of gone that comes back in a few hours with groceries or apologies. Not the kind that tucks you in at night or laughs at something silly on television. This was a different kind of gone. The kind that leaves a shape behind in the room. An emptiness you can feel even when you don't have the words for it. The house didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt hollow. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder, each second echoing through the silence like a reminder that time was moving forward even though everything inside him wanted it to stop. Somewhere in another room, a glass shifted slightly, settling into stillness. The air itself seemed heavier, harder to breathe. He didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, there was confusion, a quiet storm of questions his 7-year-old mind couldn't organize. Did I do something wrong? Is he coming back? Why didn't he say goodbye? His chest tightened, but no tears came. Just a strange, empty pressure, like something had cracked open inside him and he didn't yet know how to feel what was spilling out. From across the room, she was watching. His grandmother. She didn't rush to him, didn't fill the silence with words that would try to fix something unfixable. She had lived long enough to recognize this kind of moment, not just the pain of it, but the danger hidden inside it. Not the kind you could see on the surface, but the kind that quietly reshapes a person from the inside out. She saw it in his eyes, not just sadness. A question forming, a story beginning to write itself. In the mind of a child, maybe I'm not worth staying for. That was the crack. And she knew, if left alone, that crack could grow into something that would follow him for the rest of his life. So she moved, slowly, gently, as if approaching something fragile. She walked over and placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. Warm, steady, real. "Come here, Keanu," she said softly. Her voice didn't try to hide the truth. It didn't pretend everything was okay. It simply offered presence. He let himself be guided, his small hand slipping into hers without resistance. She led him into the living room, where the light filtered, in through thin curtains casting a soft glow over everything. In the corner sat an old velvet couch, worn at the edges, carrying the quiet weight of years and memories. She sat down first, then gently helped him up beside her. His legs dangled, too short to touch the floor, swinging slightly in the stillness. He stared ahead, not quite looking at anything, still caught somewhere between confusion and the beginning of something deeper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she folded her hands together, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if remembering something sacred. "When I was your age," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "something like this happened to me." He turned slightly, just enough to listen. "I lost everything I thought I could depend on," she continued. "And I didn't understand it. Not at first." There was no rush in her words, no urgency to explain everything, just a quiet unfolding. "But my grandmother," she paused, a faint smile touching her lips. "She taught me something. Something that saved my life more times than I can count." That caught his attention. Saved her life? He didn't fully understand what that meant, but something about the way she said it made the room feel different. Less empty, less broken, more important. She turned to him now, her eyes meeting his, not with pity, not with sadness, but with a kind of knowing that felt steady and unshakable. "Keanu," she said gently, "there's something I need to teach you." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but powerful. He didn't nod, didn't speak, but something inside him shifted. The chaos that had been swirling in his chest, the confusion, the fear, the unspoken questions, began to soften, just slightly. Not because the pain was gone, but because something new had entered the room. Curiosity. A small, flickering light in the middle of all that darkness. His grandmother leaned closer, her voice lowering, as if what she was about to say wasn't just meant to be heard, but remembered. What she was about to give him wasn't a solution. It wasn't a way to bring his father back. It was something else, something deeper. Something that would stay with him long after this moment passed, long after he grew up, long after life tested him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. A few simple words, but words that carried the weight of survival, the beginning of a prayer. And though he didn't know it yet, those words would become the thread that held him together on the days when everything else tried to pull him apart. He didn't realize it at the time, but the world had gone very quiet for him. Not the kind of quiet you hear in a peaceful room, but the kind that wraps around your thoughts and slows everything down. The ticking clock faded, the distant sounds, outside the window, blurred into nothing. Even the ache in his chest seemed to pause, as if it too was waiting for what she was about to say. His grandmother studied his face for a moment longer, as if making sure he was truly there, with her, not lost somewhere in the confusion his father had left behind. Then she reached over and gently placed her hand over his small one. Her skin was warm, steady, grounded in a way that made everything else feel less like it was slipping away. "What I'm going to tell you," she said softly, "won't make today hurt less." There was honesty in her voice, not cruel, not harsh, just real, and somehow that made it easier to listen. "But it will help you carry it." Carry it. The words were simple, but they landed differently, as if pain wasn't something to escape, but something to learn how to hold. He frowned slightly, his young mind trying to understand. How do you carry something you can't even see? She seemed to sense the question before he could ask it. "Life," she continued, "is going to take things from you. People, moments, things you wish you could keep forever." Her thumb brushed lightly over his hand, a small, comforting motion. "And if you try to fight that, if you spend your life asking why or wishing it was different," she shook her head gently, "you'll feel lost. All the time." He swallowed quietly, because that's exactly how he felt right now. Lost. She leaned back slightly, her eyes drifting for just a second, as if she was looking into her own past, remembering something she had once struggled to understand too. "I didn't know what to do when it happened to me," she admitted. "I felt angry, confused, like the world didn't make sense anymore." Her gaze returned to him, softer now. "But then my grandmother sat me down, just like this, and she gave me something." There it was again. Something. Not advice. Not comfort. Something more. Keanu's fingers tightened slightly under hers. That small spark of curiosity inside him grew a little stronger, pushing gently against the weight of everything he was feeling. "What is it?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. For the first time since the door had closed, he had spoken. And his grandmother smiled, not wide, not dramatic. Just enough to show that something important had shifted. She leaned closer, her voice lowering even more, as if what she was about to say was meant only for him. "It's a prayer," she said. The word hung in the air. He had heard the word before, of course. In passing. in moments that never really stuck. But this felt different. This didn't feel like something distant or formal. This felt personal. But not the kind people usually think of, she added gently. Not something you say to ask for things. That caught him off guard. If not for asking, then what was it for? She could see the confusion in his eyes, the way his mind was trying to make sense of something unfamiliar. This prayer, she continued, doesn't change the world around you. A pause. It changes you. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Something about the way she said it made it feel important. Not just now, not just for this moment, but for something much bigger. Something he couldn't yet see. When everything feels like it's falling apart, she said softly, when you don't understand what's happening or why, these words will help you remember who you are. Who you are. At 7 years old, that question hadn't fully formed yet. But somehow, hearing it made something stir deep inside him, like a door he didn't know existed had just been touched. He shifted slightly on the couch, his legs still dangling, but his posture different now. More present, more aware, listening. His grandmother took a slow breath, her hands folding together again, the same way they had earlier. There was intention in the movement now, like she was stepping into something sacred, not dramatic, not heavy, just meaningful. You won't understand it today, she said quietly. Maybe not for a long time. Her eyes held his, steady and certain. But one day, you'll need it. And when she said that, something inside him believed her. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough for the chaos in his chest to soften just a little more. Enough for the fear to loosen its grip. Enough for that small, flickering curiosity to grow into something steadier. A beginning. She leaned in closer, her voice now barely above, a whisper, as if the words themselves needed to be handled with care. And just before she spoke them, Keanu felt it. That strange shift again. The pain wasn't gone. His father was still gone. The questions were still there. But now, alongside all of that, there was something else. A quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, this moment wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Something that would stay with him. Something that would return to him years later, in moments far heavier than this one. His grandmother's lips parted as she prepared to speak, and the world, once again, waited. For a moment, it felt like even the air was listening. Her voice, when it finally came, was softer than anything he had ever heard. So soft it didn't feel like it was meant for the room, or even for his ears. It felt like it was meant for something deeper, something inside him he didn't yet know how to reach. Repeat after me, she whispered. He nodded faintly, his eyes fixed on her face, trying to catch every word, every breath, every pause. Let me see clearly. He hesitated for just a second, then echoed her, his small voice unsure but sincere. Let me see clearly. The words felt strange in his mouth. Not like the things children usually say, not playful, not simple. But not heavy either. Just unfamiliar. His grandmother gave a small nod, encouraging him. Let me love fully. He repeated it again, a little steadier this time. Let me love fully. Something about that line made his chest tighten slightly, but not in the same painful way as before. This was different, softer, warmer, like touching something fragile. She continued, Let me serve humbly. He followed, the rhythm starting to settle into him now. Let me serve humbly. The room seemed to hold the words as they were spoken, as if they mattered more than anything else in that moment. Then she paused, just long enough for him to feel that the last part was different. Important. Her fingers gently squeezed his hand. "Let me trust completely." He repeated it slower this time, as if something in him knew to be careful with it. "Let me trust completely." When the final word left his lips, the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something he couldn't name. His grandmother didn't speak right away. She let the moment settle, let the words find their place inside him, even if he didn't understand where that place was yet. Finally, she leaned back slightly and studied him again, not to check if he had memorized the words, but to see what had changed. "Do you know what that means?" she asked gently. He shook his head, not embarrassed, not ashamed, just honest. And she smiled. "That's okay," she said softly. "You're not supposed to understand it yet." Her hand moved from his to his shoulder, resting there with quiet reassurance. "These words aren't magic," she continued. "They won't stop bad things from happening. They won't bring people back. They won't make life fair." Each sentence was simple, clear, real. "But they will help you when nothing else makes sense." He listened closely now, the confusion still there, but no longer overwhelming. It had softened into something quieter, something more open. "They'll remind you to see what's real, not just what hurts," she said. "They'll remind you to keep your heart open, even when it wants to close." Her voice slowed, each word landing gently. "They'll remind you that you matter, not because someone stays, but because you're here." That one stayed. Even if he didn't fully understand it, something about it felt important enough to hold on to. "And when you feel lost," she added, "when the world feels too big or too heavy, these words will bring you back to yourself. Back to yourself." He looked down at his hands, still small, still unsure, still holding on to pieces of a moment he didn't know how to process. But he repeated the prayer again, in his head, quietly this time. "Let me see clearly. Let me love fully. Let me serve humbly. Let me trust completely." It didn't fix anything. His father was still gone. The house was still quiet. The questions were still there, lingering in the corners of his mind. But something had shifted. The pain no longer felt like it was swallowing him whole. It felt held. As if those words had created a small space inside him where everything didn't have to make sense right away. His grandmother watched him carefully, noticing the subtle change. The way his shoulders had relaxed just slightly, the way his breathing had steadied. She knew that look. She had seen it in herself once. The moment when pain stops being something that breaks you and starts becoming something you learn to carry. "You won't remember this day the way you think you will," she said quietly. He looked up at her. "You'll remember the feeling," she continued. "And you'll remember these words." Her eyes softened, filled with a kind of quiet certainty that only comes from living through things you once thought you couldn't survive. "And one day," she added, "you'll understand why I gave them to you today." He didn't ask when. He didn't ask how. For the first time since the door had closed, he didn't feel the need to ask anything at all. Because somehow, even without understanding, he felt like he had been given something important. Something that would stay. Something that would come back to him. Years later, in moments far bigger than this one. Moments where the stakes would be higher. Where the pain would be deeper. Where the choice between breaking and becoming would depend on something he couldn't yet see. He slid a little closer to his grandmother on the couch, resting gently against her side. And for the first time that day, he felt safe. Not because everything was okay, but because, in the middle of everything that wasn't, he now had something to hold on to. He didn't realize it then, but something had been set in motion. Not loud, not dramatic, nothing that would make anyone else in the world stop and take notice. Just a quiet imprint, like fingerprints pressed into soft clay, left by a moment that would follow him long after the details faded. Days passed, then weeks. Life, in its strange way, kept moving forward as if nothing had happened. The same streets, the same routines, the same sunlight slipping through the windows in the morning. But for him, something was different. Not obvious. No, one would have looked at him and said, "That child is changing." But he was. At night, when the house grew still again, the silence returned. Not as sharp as that first day, but still there, lingering in the corners. Sometimes he would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again. The door, the quiet, the feeling of something being taken without explanation, and every now and then without fully deciding to. The words would come back, soft, almost like a memory he hadn't chosen to remember. "Let me see clearly." He would whisper it into the darkness, unsure of why it mattered. "Let me love fully." His voice barely audible, as if he didn't want to disturb whatever was listening. "Let me serve humbly." The words felt too big for him, like wearing clothes he hadn't grown into yet. "Let me trust completely." That one always made him pause. Trust what? Trust who? He didn't know. But he said it anyway. Because somewhere, beneath the confusion, beneath the quiet ache that still hadn't fully turned into tears, there was a small part of him that believed those words meant something, even if he couldn't explain what. His grandmother never forced it. She never asked, "Did you say the prayer today?" or corrected him when he stumbled over the words. She understood something deeper, that what she had given him wasn't meant to be practiced like a routine. It was meant to be discovered. So instead, she watched. She watched the way he moved through the world now, more thoughtful, more observant. She noticed how he would pause before reacting, how his eyes seemed to search for something beyond what was right in front of him. She saw the questions forming, not just about his father, but about everything. Why do people leave? Why does it hurt this much? Why does it feel like something inside me changed? These weren't questions he asked, out loud, but they lived in him. And slowly, without him realizing it, the prayer began to shape how he carried those questions. One afternoon, weeks later, he sat alone outside, watching the wind move through the trees. Leaves shifted and danced in patterns he couldn't predict. There was no order to it, no clear reason why one branch moved and another stayed still. He frowned slightly, trying to make sense of it, and then, quietly, the words came back again. "Let me see clearly." He tilted his head, studying the movement again, but this time he wasn't trying to control it or understand it completely. He was just watching, just seeing. Something about that felt different. The frustration he usually felt when things didn't make sense. Eased. Not gone. Just softer. A few days later, he saw another kid at school sitting alone, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. There was something familiar in that posture, something he recognized without needing it explained. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, without thinking too much about it, he walked over and sat beside him. No big words, no perfect sentence. Just presence. And later that night, lying in bed, the next line came back to him. "Let me love fully." He didn't connect the two moments consciously, but something inside him did. The prayer wasn't just something he said anymore. It was starting to become something he lived, quietly, imperfectly, without even realizing it. His grandmother noticed. Of course she did. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the room in soft gold, she found him sitting by the window, lost in thought. "You've been thinking a lot lately," she said gently. He looked up, a little surprised. "Is that bad?" he asked. She smiled. "No," she said softly. "That means you're learning to see." He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he felt something warm settle in his chest again, that same feeling from the couch. Not overwhelming, not confusing, just steady. Years would pass before he truly understood what had begun that day. Years before life would test him in ways that would make that quiet moment on the velvet couch feel like the beginning of something much bigger. Because the truth was, that prayer wasn't meant for that day. It was meant for the days that hadn't come yet. The days when he would stand at the edge of giving up. The days when loss would return, heavier than before. The days when the world would try to tell him who he was supposed to be. And on those days, those simple words would find their way back to him, not as something he had to remember, but as something that had already become part of him, waiting for the moment he would need them most. Years didn't pass all at once. They stretched, slowly, unevenly, like a road that never quite ran straight. And somewhere along that road, the quiet boy who once sat on a velvet couch began to grow into someone searching for something he couldn't. Yet name, by the time Keanu Reeves reached his late teens, the world felt bigger. But not clearer. If anything, it felt more confusing. He moved through different cities, different schools, different versions of himself. Nothing stayed still long enough to feel permanent. Faces changed. Places changed. Expectations changed. And somewhere inside all that movement, a question followed him like a shadow. Where do I belong? He didn't always say it out loud. Most days, it showed up as restlessness. A quiet dissatisfaction. A sense that he was always just slightly out of place, like he was standing half a step outside of his own life, watching it instead of fully living it. Acting came into his life almost by accident. At first, it didn't feel like a calling. It felt like escape. A way to step into someone else's story when his own felt too uncertain. On stage, or in front of a camera, something shifted. The noise in his head quieted. The constant question of, who am I? Faded, replaced by something simpler. Just be this person, just for a moment, and strangely, that felt easier. But the moment always ended. And when it did, the questions came back. Stronger. More persistent. By his early 20s, he had made his way to Hollywood, carrying nothing but a dream that felt too big for his circumstances and too fragile to say out loud too often. The reality hit quickly, auditions that led nowhere. Polite smiles followed by silence, promises that dissolved into rejection, days blurred into nights, and nights into uncertainty. Sometimes he slept on couches. Sometimes he didn't sleep much at all. Money came and went like it didn't belong to him, and every no felt heavier than the last, not because of the rejection itself, but because of what it started to whisper inside him. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe this isn't for you. Maybe you've been pretending this whole time. He kept a quiet count of the rejections. Not on purpose at first, but after a while, it became a habit. A number that followed him, growing larger with each passing week. 17. 17 times in 1 month. 17 doors that didn't open. One night, after another long day that led nowhere, he found himself sitting alone in a small, dimly lit room. The kind of place that didn't feel like home, just somewhere temporary, like everything else in his life at that point. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion settling into his bones. What am I doing? He whispered to himself. The question didn't expect an answer, it just hung there. Heavy, familiar, and for a moment. He felt it again, that same feeling from years ago. Not exactly the same, but close enough to recognize. That quiet emptiness, that sense of something missing. He closed his eyes, pressing his hands together loosely, not out of habit, not out of routine, but because something inside him reached for it, reached for something steady. And then, almost without effort, the words came back. Let me see clearly. He exhaled slowly. Let me love fully. The room didn't change. Let me serve humbly. His situation didn't change. Let me trust completely, but something inside him did. Not dramatically, not instantly, just enough. Enough to create space between him and the storm of thoughts pulling him under. Enough to remind him that maybe this wasn't about forcing something to happen. Maybe it wasn't about proving himself. Maybe it was about something else entirely. He opened his eyes again. The ceiling still the same, the uncertainty still there. But his breathing steadier now, his chest no longer as tight. The next morning, nothing magical happened. No sudden opportunity. No phone call that changed everything. Just another audition. Another chance to walk into a room and be judged. But something felt different. Subtle, quiet. Instead of rehearsing what they might want, he stopped. Instead of trying to shape himself into something acceptable, he paused, and as he stood outside that audition room, waiting for his name to be called, the words came back one more time, but this time they felt clearer, not louder, just understood a little differently. Not, give me this, not make this work, but let me be who I'm meant to be. He didn't even realize he had changed the meaning slightly, but it was enough. When his name was called, he stepped inside, not as the version of himself he thought they were looking for, but simply as himself, unpolished, uncertain, real, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of that. The room wasn't impressive, no dramatic lighting, no sense of occasion, just a table, a few chairs, and people who had already seen dozens of faces before his. People who were tired, distracted, and looking for something they probably couldn't even explain themselves. He stepped in anyway, not with confidence, not with certainty, but without the usual weight of pretending. For a moment, no one said anything. One of them glanced up briefly, then back down at a paper. Another leaned back in their chair, arms crossed, studying him with a kind of quiet detachment. He could feel it, the familiar pressure creeping in. This is where you prove yourself. This is where you become what they want. That old instinct. That old fear. But then, something interrupted it. Not loudly, not forcefully, just a quiet shift in his awareness. The words, not spoken out loud this time. Just, there. Let me see clearly. He looked at the people in front of him again. But differently, not as judges, not as gatekeepers of his future, just people. Tired. Human. Looking for something real in a room full of performances. Let me love fully. The fear in his chest loosened just enough for something else to take its place. Not confidence exactly, but openness. A willingness to be seen, even if it meant being rejected again. Let me serve humbly. The audition stopped being about him for a moment. It wasn't about proving his worth. It wasn't about getting the role. It was about giving something honest to the room, something true, even if it wasn't perfect. And then, let me trust completely. That was the hardest one. Because trust meant letting go of the outcome, letting go of control, letting go of the need for this moment to define everything. He took a breath and began. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden shift into someone else, no perfect performance that demanded attention. It was simple, grounded, real. He stumbled slightly over one line, then kept going. His voice wavered for just a second, then steadied. He didn't hide the imperfections. He didn't cover them up. He let them exist. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to be flawless. He was just being honest. And something about that changed. The room, subtle but noticeable. The person who had been looking down at the paper looked up again, this time for longer. The one leaning back in the chair leaned forward slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that would make anyone gasp, but enough. Enough to show that something had landed. When he finished, the silence that followed felt different from all the other silences he had experienced in rooms like this. It wasn't empty. It was considering. One of them exchanged a glance with another. A small nod passed between them. Then someone spoke. "Thank you." Just that. Simple. Neutral. The kind of response he had heard many times before. And yet, it didn't hit the same. Because for once, his sense of worth wasn't hanging on what they said next. He nodded, turned, and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him. And for a moment, he just stood there in the hallway, waiting, listening, feeling, but not for their decision, for himself, for what had just happened inside him. And what he felt wasn't disappointment. It wasn't relief either. It was something quieter, something steadier. He had shown up as himself, fully, without hiding, without shaping himself into something else, and regardless of what happened next, that mattered. A few minutes later, the door opened behind him. He turned, not expecting much. One of the casting directors stepped out, holding the door slightly open. "Hey," they said, gesturing for him to come back in. He hesitated for just a second, then stepped forward. Inside, the energy had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to feel. They asked him to read again. Then again. A different scene this time, less structured, more open. He followed, not overthinking, not forcing anything, just staying present, just responding honestly to what was in front of him. Time blurred slightly. Minutes felt longer, then shorter. And finally, after one last exchange of glances between them, someone smiled, not the polite kind, a real one. "We'd like you for the role." The words landed softly, but their meaning carried weight. He blinked, almost as if his mind needed a second to catch up. "Wait, really?" he asked, the disbelief slipping through before he could stop it. A small laugh from across the table. "Yeah," one of them said. "Really." For a moment, everything inside him went still. Not in shock, not in excitement, but in recognition. Because deep down, he knew. It wasn't just about getting the role. It wasn't about luck. It wasn't even about talent, not entirely. It was about that shift. That moment when he stopped asking the world to give him something, and instead, allowed himself to become something. He stepped out of the building a few minutes later, the sunlight hitting his face as if the world hadn't changed at all. Cars passed. People walked by. Life continued, unaware that anything significant had just happened. But inside him, something had. The prayer hadn't given him what he wanted. It had done something far more important. It had shown him who he was, when he stopped trying to be someone else. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The success didn't arrive the way people imagine it does. There was no sudden explosion of meaning, no moment where everything inside him finally felt complete. No dramatic silence where all the questions disappeared and life suddenly made sense. It came gradually, scene by scene, film by film, name by name. And before he even had time to understand what was happening, Keanu Reeves was no longer just another struggling actor trying to find his place. He had become something else in the eyes of the world. Familiar, recognizable. A face people associated with stories, characters, and moments they would later call iconic. But inside him, something unexpected began to happen. The noise got louder. Not outside, inside. More recognition, more expectations, more pressure to remain something consistent, something shaped, something others could easily understand. And somewhere in the middle of all that attention, he started to feel it again. That same quiet emptiness, not the emptiness of failure this time, but the emptiness of arrival without fulfillment. He would sit in hotel rooms that looked perfect from the outside, clean, expensive, quiet, and feel strangely distant from everything he had worked for. Conversations happened around him, but not always with him. Laughter was there, but it didn't always reach him. And in those moments, the old question returned in a different form. Is this it? He didn't panic when it came back. That was the strange part, because now he recognized it. Not as something new, but as something familiar. Something he had carried since he was a child on that velvet couch. The same silence, the same searching, the same need for something deeper than achievement. One night, in a city far from home, he found himself sitting alone after an event he barely remembered attending. Bright lights earlier in the evening, cameras, conversations that felt rehearsed, smiles that came and went like passing scenes. Now, quiet. He sat by a window, looking down at streets that never seemed to sleep. And for a moment, he didn't think about his career. He didn't think about the next project. He didn't think about anything he had achieved. He thought about a question, a simple one, the same one a child had once asked him in a different life. Are you happy? The question didn't feel like judgment anymore. It felt like reflection. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, and closed his eyes. And there it was again. Not spoken, not forced, just remembered. Let me see clearly. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't see himself as the world saw him. Not the roles, not the fame, not the expectations, just a person. Let me love fully. He thought about the people he had met along the way, not the crowds, not the audiences, but the individuals, the ones who had shown him kindness without needing anything in return, the ones who had shared moments of truth without cameras watching. Let me serve humbly. He thought about the work that mattered, not the recognition it brought, but the connection it created. The moments where someone felt seen because of a story he had helped bring to life. Let me trust completely. This one still felt difficult. Because trust wasn't about control. It was about surrendering the illusion that he could ever fully understand the shape of his own life while he was still living it. He opened his eyes fully now. And something had shifted. Not in the world outside, but in the way he was sitting inside it. He wasn't chasing anything in that moment. Not success, not validation, not even clarity. Just presence. And then, unexpectedly, a memory surfaced. That velvet couch, his grandmother's voice, the weight of words he hadn't fully understood back then, but had somehow carried with him through everything. He realized something then. The prayer hadn't been guiding him toward success. It had been guiding him through it. Not to escape pain, but to move through it without losing himself, not to avoid emptiness, but to understand it, not to become someone else, but to become fully himself. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, something finally softened, not resolved, not finished. Just understood a little more deeply, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was searching for something missing. He felt like he was remembering something he had never truly lost. The night felt different, not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside him no longer reacted the same way to it. The world was still loud in its own distant rhythm. Cars passing, lights blinking, people living lives that would never intersect with his. But inside the quiet space he had finally learned to recognize, there was no urgency anymore. No chasing, no grasping, just stillness. Keanu Reeves stood by the window for a long time without moving, as if he was waiting for something to interrupt the silence, but nothing did. And for once, he didn't try to fill it. Instead, he let it exist. Let it breathe. Let it hold him without asking anything in return. And in that silence, something long buried began to rise, not as a memory, not even as a thought, but as a feeling. Velvet couch, his small legs swinging above the floor, a voice that didn't try to fix the world, only to steady it. His grandmother. For years, he had carried those words without fully understanding their weight. He had spoken them in moments of struggle, in moments of doubt, sometimes without even realizing he was returning to them. But now, they didn't feel like words anymore. They felt like a way of being. Let me see clearly, not to predict everything, not to control outcomes, but to stop lying to himself about what was real. Let me love fully, not carefully, not conditionally, not only when it was safe, but with the understanding that everything meaningful comes with risk, and that risk is what makes it real. Let me serve humbly, not for recognition, not for identity, but as a reminder that he was never separate from others, even when fame tried to convince him otherwise. Let me trust completely, not in outcomes, not in certainty, but in something larger than his fear, something he could feel but never fully explain. He finally moved away from the window and sat down. Not because he was tired, but because standing suddenly felt unnecessary. His life didn't flash before his eyes. There was no dramatic realization, no single moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, there was something quieter. A recognition that the story had never been about arrival. It had always been about presence, about learning how to remain open through every version of life. Loss, success, confusion, love, emptiness, meaning, and everything in between. The same boy who once sat on a velvet couch had lived through worlds he could never have imagined, and yet, he was still here, still becoming, still learning, still listening. He thought about all the people who had crossed his path without knowing the role they had played in shaping him. A child's question in Tokyo, a stranger fixing a fence in the dark, a boy in a hospital bed who spoke about loneliness with surprising clarity, moments that seemed small at the time, but had quietly rewritten something inside him. None of them were coincidences. None of them were separate. They were threads, and together they formed something he could finally see as whole. Not perfect, not complete, but connected. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time, the question that had followed him, for most of his life, didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a guide. Who am I supposed to be? And the answer finally wasn't something he had to chase, it was something he had to live. Not once, not perfectly, but again and again, in small decisions, in quiet moments. in how he treated people when no one was watching, in how he treated himself, when no one was applauding. The prayer wasn't something his grandmother gave him to escape life. It was something she gave him so he could meet it fully. And now, standing in the calm aftermath of a life lived in motion, he understood the final truth it had been pointing to all along. There was never a version of him waiting somewhere ahead. There was only the version of him choosing to be present here. Now, again, and again. The city outside kept moving, but inside, everything had already arrived.